Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Reigning Threes podcast. I'm Julian, and I'm joined here with my associate Max. And
Hello,
today we're going
everyone.
to be talking about NBA players in the 70s.
All right, so just to start us off, we're going to introduce the 70s quick. Now, Hawks, I don't know about you, but I think that the 70s are the worst decade of basketball in NBA history. Would you agree with that, or do you think it's another one?
Um, Me personally, I would disagree, just on the fact that there's some great players and
Yeah,
it was a different brand of basketball. In my
yeah,
opinion, I think the 2000s are the worst, but that's a
yeah.
conversation for another day.
I think that part of the reason I feel this way is because there wasn't really the record setting you see with like guys like Wilt or Oscar Robertson or Bill Russell, where you have these players setting records left, right, and center that still remain to this day. But at the same time, in the 70s, you didn't really have any like signature teams or signature players that were just kind of, they were universally liked and that everyone could watch them and everyone wanted to watch them. And I feel like that's kind of a detriment to just the situation of the NBA in the era. But at the same time, if you watch games from the 70s, and I know it's a different era of basketball and different things were emphasized and there was no three-point line, but it's boring. I mean, I watched a game of 1977 finals Portland, and the pace and just the system of how they ran their offense, it was a little hard to watch with being so accustomed to the modern NBA. So I just think that it's an era where you had defined styles. Back in the day, post moves were more common. Your wing players were getting into the paint instead of shooting threes. And while it was effective back then, it doesn't really translate into modern times. Would you agree with that?
Of course, definitely.
And I think a few other things about the era that kind of get in the mix of things is that the NBA had its fair share of issues both publicly and amongst itself. There was two leagues of basketball, the ABA and the NBA, and this divide kind of separated out the talent. Like a lot of talented players were in the ABA instead of the NBA. So there weren't a lot of TV deals. There wasn't a lot of fan support in the era, and I think that's a big part of why players from this era go unnoticed in terms of their standing in NBA history, just because of the fact that there wasn't really any publicity to the NBA during this era.
hmm I agree. One thing I was going to say, you already said it, but the 70s is definitely one of the most forgotten eras in basketball, and a bunch of the star players in that area are very forgotten, and some of the players we're going to be talking about are forgotten players
Yeah,
in that era. But one thing I can say, I'm going to recant my statement about the 2000s being the worst, because I remember reading a book about Rudy Tomjanovich and Kermit
yeah,
Washington, which was an event that happened in the 70s. And although people like to say that the 90s was the physical era, it was the 70s because
yeah,
fighting was very common.
yep,
And the commissioner, Larry O'Brien, at the time, was trying to stop that issue of fighting. So, yeah, I
yeah.
definitely agree. There was a lot of issues with drugs in the 70s.
Most definitely. I
And
have a stat on that actually. Some reports say up to 75% of all players in the league were on drugs at the time.
yeah, and like some players that we're going to be talking in depth, were definitely alcoholics or drug users.
Yeah,
And then there's also some players that we're not necessarily going to be talking about that were great players, such as David Thompson, whose careers were basically derailed with cocaine and other drugs.
yep,
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. The 70s, it was kind of that weird dark age in the league.
yeah. And I think a lot of people give the 70s credit for having parity within the league where you didn't have a signature team of the decade where you had the Bucks win one, the Lakers win one, the Knicks win two, the Celtics win two. You had all these different teams winning. But I think that's actually detrimental to the era because there is no top 10 team where you have a team like the Showtime Lakers who made it to the finals 8 times in 10 years or the Bulls. It kind of hinders because there's not really a team that you can definitively remember from this era and think that was the team of the 70s. There really isn't any of that for this era.
hmm I agree. And another thing is, there's not really a player you could pinpoint as a player of the 70s
Yep.
as well. Because obviously, in the early 70s, Kareem was the guy.
Yeah.
He was a dominant force. And then there was also other guys. like Dr. J, who were initially in the ABA and then moved on to the NBA, and many people considered him to be one of the greats,
Yeah.
and one of the best players in the game.
Yeah. The thing about the talent, especially, was I have it written here. Kareem was the best player during the decade, and he only won one championship. So it's not really good for an organization that's promoting him as their best player for him to only have one ring during the decade. It's kind of like you want him to be on those stages to better promote your sport. But that just wasn't able to happen due to a variety of reasons with the Lakers management during the time. But at the same time, you kind of want your best players to be showcased all the time, and that just really wasn't the case for the 70s.
Yeah, and especially the Sixers was another team which could have been one of the teams of the century, or the team of the decade rather,
Yeah,
because the Sixers had a very talented lineup as well. But it was almost one of the things that the Sixers have now or had last year, where they just have a bunch of star caliber players, but they don't really fit together.
yeah, most definitely. And then one other thing I have to say is a lot of the finals teams were pretty weak. There were a lot of teams making it to the finals that didn't even have 50 wins. Like I have it written here. In 1978, the finals featured the Seattle Supersonics and the Washington Bullets. That year, the Bullets won 44 games and the Sonics won 47. That's the equivalent to last year's San Antonio Spurs and Orlando Magic playing each other in the finals. So I
Wow.
think by having these middling teams make the finals, again, it really kind of took away from the marketing the league was able to do. Because when you promote an organization, you have to have the best players and the best teams. By having these mediocre teams, it just really didn't help out the league's promoting during this era.
I agree. So
So
Max, or you're gonna say something?
you go ahead.
So Max, do you want to talk about players, like certain players in the 70s, and more specifically the player you think has had the biggest cultural impact?
Yes. For me, the guy with the biggest cultural impact is Julius Irving, Dr. J, and he did this for a variety of reasons. So, just a little bit of stats on Dr. J. During his career, he was a one-time NBA champ, and he was also part of the ABA during his prime years. So, he was a two-time ABA champ. During his career in the NBA, he was a three-time finals runner-up in 77, 1980, and 1982. He won the MVP award once in his career, and he was a 16-time All-Star. And for his career, he had over 30,000 points and 10,000 rebounds, which is a very exclusive club. But for him, the style and finesse he brought to the NBA, which he used especially with his unreal combination of athleticism and finesse on the court, it made him a spectacle for people to watch. And that brought in a lot of viewers, a lot more than the NBA previously had, to be able to watch him. And I think that he's one, at the time especially, he was one of the game's most beloved players. And especially during that era of drugs and fighting and low publicity, he really helped popularize it to a lot of different people at the time.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. J was one of those guys where he was definitely an influence for the next generation of players. Obviously,
Yeah,
you have guys like Michael Jordan speaking very highly of him,
yeah,
and like I've said in previous podcasts, it's kind of that evolution effect. You have
yeah,
guys like Dr. J and David Thompson, who are primarily slashers.
yeah,
They leave a mark on the next generation of Michael Jordans, and then the Michael Jordans leave a mark on the LeBrons and Kobe's of the world.
yeah,
And that's how basketball eventually gets better
yeah.
over
The,
time.
the thing about Dr. J especially is when it comes to great dunking players, Dr. J really set it off. In the early 70s, dunking wasn't really a flashy kind of thing. It was more of a just a statement. And also you had it where in the NCAA, dunking was actually banned because of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's dominance at UCLA. So by having a guy like Dr. J come in, who can do these crazy windmills and tomahawks over guys double his size in a lot of aspects, like Bill Walton in 1977 Finals, one of the most famous plays in NBA history. It just kind of brought a new light to the idea of dunking, and it really incorporated dunking as part of basketball culture going forward after him. And I think that's really important to how the NBA kind of became the business it is today, where it's made millions of dollars off guys like Jordan and his ability to dunk, and as well as guys like LeBron. And so I think Dr. J really kicked off the era of dunking as a phenomenon within the NBA.
I 100% agree. And also just seeing like the way the league's now, how athletic it is. You have guys like Torrey Craig doing
Yeah,
360 dunks in game. Guys like Jordan Clarkson doing that. When at the start, it was the two main dunkers, or three rather, were Dr. J,
yep,
David Thompson, and
yep,
George Gervin. And I remember watching a dunk contest where all three of them participated,
yep,
and David Thompson did a 360 dunk, and the announcer didn't even call it a 360 dunk. He called it like a turnaround reverse
yeah.
dunk.
They had no idea what to call it because guys like this, they really they changed the way we see dunking. Back then, you see a 360 and it's a complete marvel to them. But now it's like, well, we've seen it before, you know? But back then, the stuff they were doing, it's just unreal in scope
Yeah.
for a lot of people back then.
Yeah, and then in the same dunk contest, Dr. J did a free throw line dunk,
The very first.
very first. And now you have guys like Zach LaVine doing near windmill, free throw line windmill dunks or between the legs. Even Derek Jones, this past dunk contest, did like a near windmill dunk from the free throw line. So it's
Yep.
just crazy to see how those guys are the pioneers for these players.
Yep. And I think that, like I said, the big thing with Dr. J is his ability to dunk and combine style and finesse. That's really what make him one of the most influential players of the era. Because in an era where basketball wasn't really moving forward in terms of viewership and fans, Dr. J really kind of sparked this once he carried over from the ABA. A lot of people believe he's the reason why the two leagues merged, and by having that, it kind of brought in a lot of reforms. It eventually brought in the three-point line, which is a big staple of how the NBA has evolved even today. And I think that, like I said, just his style and finesse and absolute craftiness he was able to bring to the court, that really kind of sparked the NBA's modern age in terms of how it's progressed as a sport and the styles and dunking ability that we see today in the game.
Hmm. I agree. Now, a question I have for you. So, on Christmas, there
Yep.
is a documentary about Dr. J, about
Yeah.
his career.
Yeah.
And um, one thing that a lot of NBA fans don't recognize in Dr. J's game is that he played in the ABA. Like a bunch of people know that, but when it comes to his legacy, his basketball legacy, that's kind of thing that kind of tarnishes his overall legacy. Just
Yeah.
the fact that he played in the NBA. Do
Yeah.
you think the numbers he put up in the ABA would be the same if he started off at the NBA level right away?
I think they would have been a little bit different because the impression I get from the ABA, it was very lenient on scoring. They had the 3-point line, they had very modest defenses, and apparently a lot of players would go out of their way to avoid like contact with Dr. J just because he was their number one marketing tool. So I figure that if he was in the NBA, he'd still be easily a 25-point per game scorer. I mean, he won NBA MVP in 1981 towards the tail end of his career. So I think that he still would have been a great player, would have averaged high 20 points, made a few final series, but he wouldn't have had quite the dominance they did in the ABA. Because there were stretches of years where he was averaging 34 points, 30 points, and like 11 rebounds. And I think those numbers would have been trimmed off a little bit in the NBA, but he still would have been a dominant player in the end.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that I also want to touch on, which is going to be a reoccurring theme amongst these next couple of podcasts, especially when we talk about the 70s, 80s, and 90s. When
Yep.
we talk about these great players, we also have to remember that they are in the era that they're in.
Yes.
Okay? And without these players, you don't have the NBA it is today. Because
Yeah.
right now, the combination of pace, athleticism in today's NBA, it's looking like it's going to be one of the most talented eras of all time. The
Yep.
2010s, late 2010s, was the start, and I think this 2020s decade is looking like it's going to be a real exciting time for basketball. But
Yep.
one thing that you guys have to remember is that without these pioneers of the game, none of this happens.
Yeah.
And
And I find a lot of people, they just think, what would they be like today? Which is something we will talk about. But at the same time, without them, maybe the game wouldn't be what it is today. So it's important to remember that while they were playing in a different NBA, they still did a lot of things that are still in the game today and are still things that are very important to how the game is played.
yeah, for sure. And this transitions onto my player, who I personally think would be a good fit in the NBA. Maybe not at the level he played, but if we'll talk about this later, but if we account for the way the game's played now and just his overall work ethic, he'd definitely be a dominant player. It's Pistol Pete, Pete Maravich. His impact on basketball starts all the way back to his college days, where he's the NCAA leader in points, I believe. And he is also has the highest points per game in the NCAA history with 44.2 points, which is insane.
Yeah.
And the only reason why it's that high and that there's other greats that don't have it that high is because he played for a low-level LSU team at the time. You have to remember, LSU, before Pete Maravich, was nowhere close to the program it is now.
Yeah.
And he essentially put LSU on the map by just him scoring a ridiculous amount of points. He was the first LSU player to get drafted in school history. And without him, I don't think players like Shaq and Ben Simmons go to those schools.
They'd certainly be less motivated to, yes.
Yeah. And then moving on to that NBA, where he started off on Atlanta, which was a rough time for him. Although he still got his points, he had two other teammates with the name of Lou Hudson,
Yep.
and I forget the other teammate's name, but they had a big man. And those two guys, they were fundamentally sound players, and they didn't really agree with his play style. The big man's name was Walt Bellamy, by the way.
Just got him here.
And you also had coaches like Pat Riley at the time who didn't like his game, who were highly against the way he played. He was considered a globetrotter, which, funny enough, he was offered to be on the Globetrotters as the number one first white player to ever play for the team.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to think about.
Yeah. I think
if you look at like the way he plays the game, how he was shooting deep shots without a three-point line, and just the way the crazy passes he'd make, the crazy dribble moves he'd do at the time, which right now aren't crazy. You could go to an LA Fitness and you see guys doing exactly what Pete Maravich are doing. But at the time, that stuff was never seen before. Just like how if you go into like the 60s and 50s with players like Bob Cousy, he's just doing simple dribble moves with one hand.
Yeah.
But at the time, that stuff was like monumental. No one did that before.
Yeah. With Pistol Pete, he really got hindered by the fact that when he was playing, there was no three-point line. In the one season where he played that there was a three-point line, he shot 66%. So It would have been crazy to see just what his numbers would have looked like in his best years if there had been a three-point line, because a lot of players at the time, like I previously said during this era, their main focus was if you're a guard, you pass it into a big man and they can do the work. If you're a wing, you try to slash, and if you're a big, you play from the post. So to have a guy like Maravich who openly took long shots, it would have been interesting to see if his scoring numbers would have just ballooned because of the ability to shoot threes. Mm-hmm. And like you said, a lot of people didn't like his playing style just because he was glitzing, like he was like Dr. J. He was glitz and glamour in an era of boring kind of play. So his ability to especially cross over and use complicated ball handling moves, they really did pioneer just modern basketball handles and just how point guards kind of operate in the present.
Yeah, for sure. And just to mention that 66%, it is on 15 shots, but it's still pretty incredible going 10 for 15. And then you also need to look at it at his work ethic. He has some drills that are still applicable today when it comes to coordination. And a legendary coach, Red Auerbach, said Pistol Pete's success is by no accident. The reason why he's Pistol Pete is because he puts in the work. If you hear stories about Pistol Pete, like just the amount of work he put into basketball, it will truly blow your mind. And you'll realize, like, it's no fluke that he was that good.
Yeah, most definitely.
Another thing I have to mention, the only big knock on his career really is his team success. Yeah. And also how he kind of had a short career due to injury.
Yeah.
But his team success is the main one. Because Atlanta, he didn't have a particularly good team. they were a sub 500 team. Although there was some solid players, the team wasn't good enough. And then when he went to the New Orleans Jazz, which is now the Utah Jazz, his team wasn't really good either.
Yeah.
Another thing that I have to mention is in his career high game, where he scored 68 points without a 3-point line as a guard, which is insane to think about. If you take out, put a 3-point line on it and track all of his shots, and also take away a 2 that was discounted because of a charge, which wasn't really a charge, Pistol Pete could score up to 75 points that night.
Jesus.
And when you think about that, like in perspective, there's guys. Will Chamberlain has the most 70-point games, and then other than Will, I believe there's only 5 other guys to score 70.
Thompson, Booker, Kobe, David Robinson, and I think that's it. So
I think there's one more guy, but that's not the point. Yeah, there might be 5 guys. Actually, but yeah, there's. Pardon?
I'll look it up. You keep going.
Yeah, there's not too many guys that have scored 70 in the game. And imagine if you put a 3-point line for Pistol Pete. That's insane. And also, you have to take into account, he was also getting assists that game. And he had some crazy passes that game. If you actually watch the highlights, you'll realize that this guy was he was an entertainer on the basketball court.
Yeah.
And
the other guy was 70 points, Elgin Baylor. And you're right, he had 6 assists that game, which for a game that high scoring, that's impressive.
Mm-hmm. And also in the era where guards weren't necessarily racking up assists. Like Bob Cousy's era, he was a 10-time assist champ or something like that, and he was getting less than 8 assists a game. So although it's not the same era, still 6 assists was pretty good. It's not like players now where they're getting 10 assists every other game.
Yeah. But still, I mean, at that time, 6 assists, that's pretty good for a guy who scored 68 points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then also, just the impact-wise, you can't tell me that what players are doing today didn't start off from Pete Maravich. If you watch his highlights, this guy was doing between-the-legs dribble moves before, a between-the-legs was a common thing. That used to be, a novelty play.
Yeah.
And you have guys like that. And, again, it just shows evolution. You start off with Bob Cousy's handles. You move on to Elgin Baylor's handles. Then it goes to Pistol Pete's. When Pistol Pete was dribbling the ball, his handles were – Rick Barry said that he never saw anything like that.
Yeah. I know that we can't show it as we talk, but there's a clip of him doing a dribble demonstration where it's him just dribbling it in front of his legs, dribbling it behind. And the caption, he's with a coach, and the coach says, "Do not try this at home." That's how advanced his dribble moves were at the time. Well, it may not seem like much to us. These really revolutionized how players were able to use a basketball when they had it in their hands.
Mm-hmm. And then, without Pistol Pete, you don't have guys like Magic Johnson.
Yeah.
And without Magic, you don't have guys like AI. And without AI, you don't have guys like Steph Curry and Kyrie Irving. That's the natural process of sports or any particular thing, whether it's medicine or anything like that. You have one guy, one genius that started it, and then you work your way through.
Yeah. Stylistically, really similar to James Harden, I think, where he's got these dribble moves, he's got the ability to shoot, and he's got the ability to move the ball as well. But the only reason that he's going to go down, in Maravich's case, has been downgraded throughout history, and in Harden's case, he eventually will be, it's just because, like you said, the lack of winning. But at the same time, he did set the standard in terms of ball handling abilities, like we've been saying, for generations to come. So I think that's why he's one of the most influential players of the era.
Yeah. And then one thing before we move on, we have to mention is Pistol Pete did die at the age of 40 playing basketball after a church league game. And this also, before Pistol Pete became a Christian, he did struggle with alcoholism throughout his career and also when he left. So that just shows even the legends had to deal with stuff like that.
Yeah. if I'm not mistaken, he predicted his death 15 years earlier, where he said he'd play 10 years in the NBA and die of a heart attack at the age of 40, which is creepily exactly what happened. So it's just
Yeah.
one of those weird coincidences. But at the same time, I mean, he had a great career, but a lot of the actions that the players took in the 70s, they wouldn't be able to get away with it in today's NBA.
100% agree.
All right, so then those are our most influential players. But the other thing we kind of wanted to talk about were some of the guys who are either really underrated from this era or guys who, like we said before, would be able to stand in today's NBA and have pretty good careers. So we'll start with you, Hoxa. Who is your pick for a guy that is pretty underrated from this era?
So this guy, he's a guy that a lot of youngins don't really know or don't particularly care about.
Yep.
I found out about this guy, if I'm being honest, by playing 2K My Team. I had no idea who this guy is. I saw him on top 50 lists back in the day before Steph Curry and all those guys. And he had a funny name, and that's Bob McAdoo.
Yep.
When I watched his highlights, I was in awe to see how advanced he was as a big man, and just like the overall machine he was.
Yeah.
So, in his first 4 years, he had a 3-year stretch where he was a 3-time scoring champ.
Yep.
He was also a 2-time NBA champ, an MVP, and a Rookie of the Year. So he definitely had the accolades to back up a great Hall of Fame career. The one big thing why Bob McAdoo gets forgotten is he won the championships as a sixth man on the Showtime Lakers, or
Yep.
It was either Showtime or pre-Showtime, but it was on the Lakers with Magic Johnson, Kareem James Worthy, all those guys. And then also his career kind of dipped, and the longevity of his success wasn't necessarily there. But if you look at Bob McAdoo's game, his ability as a 6'10 center slash power forward in that range to dribble the ball up the court and pull up and take pull up jumpers, make them consistently, make deep post fades.
Yeah.
It's insane to see, especially in an era in the 70s where the big man gets in the post, muscles his way through, and scores a layup within 3 feet. Bob
Yeah.
McAdoo, if you were to compare him to a player right now, he's like the modern day Carmelo Anthony and the modern, like, kind of a KD without a 3-point shot. He was like the first version of that.
Yeah.
And due to injuries, it's a shame that his career was derailed.
Yeah. I think another big reason that he kind of goes under the radar is when he was in his prime, when he won his MVP, he was playing for Buffalo, who now is the LA Clippers. But Buffalo, it's not the biggest of markets. And even for, like we've been saying, the 70s, an era where there wasn't any TV coverage or fan press, you get even less of that in Buffalo. So I think that because the fan base of Buffalo and the Clippers don't really remember him that much, it kind of leads to everyone else forgetting about him too.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But another thing is, like, since his play style was so foreign for bigs, it just like it's not wasn't the thing you could market back then. When you have guys like Kareem just dominating in the post.
Yeah. I mean, he was also a pretty good playmaker from what I'm looking at. And I think like a guy who can transcend what you think of. Sometimes for that era especially, it can be a bit scary where, like we said with Pistol Pete, because they were so ahead of their time, they just kind of got a little forgotten about because they were thinking, what is this guy doing? How is this working kind of thing? So I think that in particular, like that foreign style of play, it just leads to a lot of people just kind of dismissing them during their prime.
Yeah. And then he was also a great shot blocker in his prime as well. His most shots blocked in a season was 3.3, which is insane. When you look at his like defensive accolades, he doesn't have any. And also, if you look at his regular accolades, like he only has 5 All-Stars, and he's on the All-NBA team 2 times. So it's kind of hard to really make a case as like one of the greatest big men ever, although he has the championships. But if you're looking at a pure skill thing, he's definitely up there. in the era, of course. Now, if you look at what the big men are doing, they're basically doing everything he did back then.
Yeah. Well, he was a good precursor to things to come, I guess.
Hmm.
So, anyways,
And he
oh,
was like, or go ahead. Okay. Well, I was also going to say, like, if you were to give another comparison to him, kind of like a Dirk Nowitzki type player,
yeah,
Dirk mixed with like Bam Adebayo, I guess, as a guy like Bam in the sense of his like playmaking ability, him able to dribble the ball up the court,
yeah,
and then Dirk also like with the post fades, the not necessarily lack of defense, but the
kind
average
of
below average defense, like that man defense.
like Charles Barkley, kind of say.
Yeah, like those types of power forwards. He was definitely the inspiration for those guys.
Yeah. All right then. Well, your pick, it's very good. I like my pick, and I've got a few pretty good reasons why he's forgotten about, and that's Rick Barry of the San Francisco at the time Warriors, and eventually Golden State Warriors. So, pretty much what I have written for basically to sum up Rick Barry up is an extremely talented yet a severely flawed person and kind of a douchebag. So for his career, Rick Barry averaged 25, 7, 5, and 2. He has one NBA championship and a finals MVP. He was top 5 in the MVP voting on 3 separate occasions. He was a 6-time All NBA first and a 4-time All ABA first, which I'll get back to in a minute. He led the NBA in steals once, led the NBA in free throw percentage 6 times, and he was a 12-time All Star. And during his time, he was really a unique player in the sense that he was kind of in the point forward mold that we see today, where he was a guy at the small forward position who could get you 25 points and score from anywhere on the court, including the 3-point line, because in the ABA, he was a pretty good 3-point shooter. But at the same time, he was a really good playmaker. In his best season as a pro, he averaged 35 points a game, which is the highest scoring average for a season behind Wilt Chamberlain, James Harden, and Michael Jordan, while at the same time consistently averaging 5 or 6 assists a game. And I think with Rick Barry is in the modern NBA, his ability to lead an offense as well as play make and rebound at a high level. I think with him, you'd be able to see shades of a guy like James Harden or like Luka Doncic, where he can score and he can lead your team to a pretty good amount of success. And the other thing about Barry is, even though he was this offensive hub for the Warriors to operate, he was a pretty good defender. Like I said, he led the league in steals once, and he was able to hold his own against the bigger wings of the time. But I think the big reason, like I said, from what I'm hearing a lot, is he was not a very good guy. All of his teammates hated him. Coaches didn't like him. Executives within the organization didn't like him. Opposing players didn't really have respect. And there's dozens of quotes that just say he wasn't really good to any of his teammates. A lot of people kind of have an impersonation that he thought he was better than everyone else. Like he held himself to a better standard, and he'd yell at you if you didn't think that way. And in addition, he probably was a racist. And he has a few quotes out there, like in 1988, Michael Jordan was in a dunk contest where he did a leaning windmill. And at the time, Rick Barry was quoted as to saying the dunk was called Chinese Superman because of the slant and the sideways on it. And also, there were a few times where he called out Bill Russell on national television, and according to some, he didn't mesh with any of his African American teammates. So in the end, he wasn't really a nice guy, and I think that's a big part of the reason why he gets kind of left in the dust in terms of NBA rankings, in terms of history.
Yeah. I mean, me personally, I don't really know all that about Rick Barry. The only thing I really know is his underhand free throw.
Yes.
Um, and like I just knew he was a great scorer and he led the Warriors to a championship, or was it the Warriors?
Yeah, at the
Yeah.
time it was the Warriors.
Yeah, he led the Warriors to a championship. But other than that, like he seemed like a good player, but like like you said, and kind of the reoccurring theme for the 70s, a forgettable player as well.
Yeah. And the other thing about him is, like we said with Dr. J, a lot of his best years were with the ABA. 5 of his prime years were from the ages of 24 to, actually not 24, but from the ages of 23 to 27, he was in the ABA. So during that time frame, those are usually the years where players are not at their peak, but they're nearing it. And so because those years were missed playing in the ABA, which again didn't have too much marketing or credibility as an organization in terms of fan viewership, I think that's another big part of the reason why he's kind of forgotten about as an NBA legend.
Hmm. But he did have sons in the NBA too. So
Yeah, one of them won a dunk contest, right?
yeah, I think Brent Berry did.
Bones won what, 2 titles, maybe 3. Him and his family have had good careers in basketball. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, definitely.
And then after Barry, I have one other guy that I kind of want to bring up for being underrated. And I think a part of it is, again, lack of viewership. And the other part was he's overshadowed by his teammates, and that's John Havlicek of the Boston Celtics. He's all-time leading scorer for the Boston Celtics, 11-time All-NBA, 8-time champion, and he won a Finals MVP. He was really, again, like Barry, where he was a two-way star who was a really good defender, could score from everywhere. And he was also a really good passer too, because in his best season, he averaged 8 assists per game. For his career, he averaged around 5. So I think he's another guy where he was a legitimate superstar, and he could definitely be a good player on a titles contending team, and he could win titles. But just because of the fact that he played with Bill Russell and Bob Cousy and guys like that, he just gets mixed up a bit in terms of how great he really was as a player.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of players on on those Celtics teams that kind of get overshadowed by Bill Russell and Bob Cousy.
Yeah.
Obviously, Bill Russell right now, he's considered a top 5 player by most people.
Yeah.
Although that's something that's up for debate, depending on the way you look at basketball. And then Bob Cousy was considered one of the, if Mikan was like the first superstar in the NBA, Bob Cousy was considered like the first megastar in the NBA. So there's like a bunch of players like that won a bunch of championships, had a bunch of all stars, but were just overshadowed by those players. Like another player, I think I'm not too sure he played in the '70s, but I know he played with Bill Russell. It's Sam Jones. Like he's a 10-time champ, and no one talks about him. But like obviously, I'm looking at Havlicek's numbers, and he's certainly had years where one, it's insane. He played 45 minutes a game.
Yep.
One season, so he definitely had the cardio to do that, which is insane.
Yeah.
And then there's season where he's averaged like 28, 29 points per game, which is crazy to think about.
So I think that, again, with him, it's just, I think a big part of the recurring theme of this is these guys don't get respected enough just because of the era, especially they played in, where even if they were great, like Havlicek was in the 70s, they just didn't get the publicity necessary to really take off and become household names.
Hmm.
So anyways, is there anyone else you'd like to bring up? Or
I mean, this guy we kind of both talked about earlier on, and you said you didn't want to talk about him because of his team success, but I'll bring him up anyway, and that's Elvin Hayes.
Yeah.
Elvin Hayes, similar to Bob McAdoo, in certain sense, he was like one of the guys that can shoot a post fade, like a deep post fade.
Yeah.
But he was also able to use his strength to score.
Yeah.
I believe he's top 10 in points and rebounds. Like
He is.
total
That's kind of why I wanted to talk about him, where he is top 10 in points and rebounds. So you'd think you'd get a little more credit, but a lot of that had to do with the old Karl Malone syndrome, where a lot of that is just a result of him only missing like 10 games in his career. So a big part of that is just his durability, which is obviously important to have as a pro, but the career numbers are kind of inflated. And the other big thing with Hayes is a lot of people say he vanished from every clutch moment he possibly could. And it was recurring throughout his entire career where he never played good in any game sevens or any fourth quarters. So I think that's just another big reason why he's kind of downtrodden, where part of it is his longevity, and that's how he was able to accumulate those stats. And also just he has James Harden, DeMar DeRozan kind of issues where he kind of vanishes in big moments.
Yeah, but the only difference between him and those types of players is he won a championship.
Yeah,
Now, although like he did have another all-time great in Wes Unseld by his side,
yeah,
which rest in peace, he recently died. Like he was still a very good player in his prime.
yeah,
I remember watching his highlights. One thing that really stuck out to me was just like the culture that he brought to the teams he played for,
yeah,
um, and also just the athleticism. Like there's a lot of plays that he did that weren't really common amongst big men at the time. Like he'd catch a lot of lobs off coming down a down screen, which in the 70s, like that's pretty insane to think about.
yeah.
And just another thing that like it's kind of funny is that every time he'd have the ball, the fans would chant "E," which is just something I found funny.
Yeah. With our selections in mind, I kind of assembled like an unofficial like all decade team where it's just the best players from that decade. So would you like me to name them off and see if those sound right?
Of course.
So I kind of did it where I have the first team and I just have a bunch of guys who are also like under consideration. So for point guard, I chose Walt Frazier from the Knicks. So during the decade, two-time champ, multiple time All-Star, just a really good player for the majority of the decade and able to get the Knicks their only titles that have made them such a pristine franchise. But he's a big part of that, and I think again another player where great player, but just because of the era he played in, kind of gets overshadowed. Shooting guard, I have Rick Barry for the Warriors, one-time champ, multiple-time All-Star, led the league in free throw percentage and steals. He was second in MVP voting in 1975, and he probably should have won, but that's another debate for another time. But anyways, at small forward, Julius Erving for the Sixers. Like I said, three-time finalist, MVP in the ABA, and just scoring All Stars, All NBA, brought this culture to the NBA. Power forward Elvin Hayes for the Bullets and the Rockets, one-time champ, three-time finalist, All Stars, All NBAs, pretty good player. And then center Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, obviously the most dominant player from the decade, and also the best player from the decade. We didn't really want to talk about him because while he was great, he didn't really influence too much of how the game is played. I mean, he had these 5 MVPs and all NBAs and rings, but in terms of who you think of as most influential players in basketball, he's really not exactly on that podium. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and also if you look at his game style, it's heavily outdated. Similar to players like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain.
Yeah,
Basically, all of their points came from the paint. The only other dominant superstar that I could think about that's like similar game style is Shaq.
yeah,
And even Shaq was kind of like more power. Um, I like a lot of people say that Kareem was finesse, which I guess if you're like looking at this skyhook, he
yeah,
could make that shot from multiple feet out. But he was also heavily reliant on his physical attributes. I mean, the skyhook kind of gets romanticized a bit. He wouldn't just skyhook the ball all the time. He'd use baby hooks. He'd just go up with the ball
yeah.
sometimes.
In the NCAA, he dunked so much they had to ban it. So,
Hmm.
but the thing about him is like, yeah, he had all these great moments, and his post game was great, and his ability to score around the basket was great. But at the same time, you don't see anyone else doing sky hooks. You don't really, while he was easily one of the three greatest basketball players of all time, people don't really talk about him as much just because his style just didn't really impact how the game is played more than any other player.
Yeah, and also like his like scoring record as the most points of all time. It kind of it's like a crazy amount of points. No, like very few people have the opportunity to break that.
Yeah.
But it's also like just a testament to like his longevity
Yep.
and his ability to play multiple seasons. Like you said, Karl Malone, Elvin Hayes, those guys. Like although Kareem in his prime was dominant, um, his longevity at the end of the day is what kept him afloat at that
Yeah.
and like kept him up in the
Yeah.
scoring limits.
And the other thing about Kareem is he didn't in those years where he was first a Laker from about 75 to 79, he never won in the playoffs, and that was because he didn't really have another sidekick. So the other thing about him in this era is that he needed players around him, and he just didn't get it. So because of that, his lack of success outside of the championship in '71, it just kind of impacts people a little differently.
Yeah, and another thing you have to remember, Kareem at the time, one, he was like a pretty hated player. A bunch of guys did not like him.
Yeah.
Um, and because of his attitude, mentioned this at the start of the podcast, but Kareem was getting into a lot of fights,
Yep.
and he was a hothead. He broke his hand getting into a fight,
Yep.
and the NBA at the time, like it was so poorly run, where his suspension was just his injury. He
Yep.
didn't even get suspended. It just, oh, you broke your hand? Okay, well, that's your suspension, I guess.
Yep.
And like the Lakers, instead of going for players um, that had skill in the draft, they drafted Kermit Washington
Yep.
with the sixth pick in the draft just so he could be that enforcer type player and to protect Kareem from getting into fights.
Yep. It was less about their talent and their fit and more about just that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
where they almost value fighting more than they do that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you have a second team?
I don't really have a second team, but I have a bunch of guys who are on the cusp. So, John Havlicek for the Celtics.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, all-star, pretty good player, made a few All-NBAs, won 2 rings. David Cowan for the Celtics, or Cowens, again, 2 rings, an MVP award, few All-NBAs. Wes Unseld for the Bullets, regular All-Star, All-NBA, Finals MVP and champion, as well as 3-time runner-up. Dennis Johnson for the Sonics. Now, he could also be folded kind of into the 80s because of his later success with the Celtics. But at the same time, he won a ring with Seattle in '78, and he was Finals MVP for them, so that kind of comes in handy. Bill Walton for the Portland Trailblazers, one-time MVP, Finals MVP in '77, few All-Star games. I think a big reason why he isn't mentioned in this decade is he showed up later on the scene, and then he missed 3 years of his career in the early '80s because of foot injuries. So because of those, he never really got to become the player he could. But still, even in his relatively short prime, he did have a good impact on the game, and he was a legitimate star for Portland. A few other guys, George Gervin for the Spurs, amazing scorer, multiple-time All-Star, one of the most Iceman, one of the most finessing players, like kind of Dr. J, where he had style and the ability to score and brought attention to the league. One other guy I've written down is Bob McAdoo for the Braves as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone
Yeah.
else you'd like to add?
Not so much like actually, yeah, there's a couple people. So Bob Lanier, he
Yep.
was a ABA player and then eventually or I don't know, I think he might have been an ABA player. And he joined the league around the time they merged, the NBA and ABA merged.
Yep.
Like his best season, he scored 25, 14, and 3.
Yep.
As a center, that's pretty good numbers. And then there's also like a bunch of other players that don't get talked about, such as Calvin Murphy.
Yep.
He was like a 5A player, apparently super fast, could just blaze anyone in a race, and
Yep.
also a physical player. And then there's like other tiny players like Nate Archibald, another guy a bunch of people in that era talk about. Um, Obviously, his time playing for the Kings. He had some great seasons in the league too. But other than that, you got pretty much everyone else.
Yep.
Oh, another guy, Willis Reed. He played on the Knicks.
Yeah.
Pretty legendary guy. Some of his stories on how he came back in the middle of the game after getting injured.
Yep.
Basically, what like him and Walt Frazier are the only reasons why the Knicks have championships and aren't a complete laughing stock.
Yeah, we'll definitely have a why the Knicks are the most overrated franchise. But the only reason that they're not one of the worst franchises and one of the reasons why they're not basically just Sacramento, it's because of Frazier and Reed, where these guys for 3 or 4 years were able to make the Knicks relevant enough to sustain the franchise for 50 years almost now. So it's because of those guys that the Knicks are really a legendary franchise to this day.
Yeah.
All right. So that about wraps it up for our discussion on the most impactful and the most underrated legends of the 1970s. So feel free to give us any comments if you are watching this. But otherwise, just try to have fun, guys. So we'll talk to you later.